In the year 2000, research was done by David Myers. David Myers from Hope College. Some of you who have studied social psychology may have read his textbook. Did research looking at psychological abstracts. And what he looked at was the ratio between quote-unquote negative research and quote-unquote positive research. And here is what he found from 1967 to the year 2000. This was around the time when positive psychology started. What he found in the 33 years are over 5,000 articles on anger. 5,000 research articles on anger. He found over 41,000 research articles on anxiety. And over 50,000 articles on depression. And then he looked at positive words, positive research. He looked for research on joy, and he found a staggering 415 studies. It does get better. He looked at research on happiness, and he found close to 2,000 articles on happiness in 33 years. Life satisfaction came out top, over 2,500 studies. Still, if you look at that, the negative studies versus the positive studies, the ratio that you get is 21 to 1. For every one article on some positive aspect, some positive element of life, well-being, satisfaction, joy, happiness, you get 21 articles on depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, neurosis, and so on. Ratio of 21 to 1. Very depressing ratio, I must admit. In fact, it makes me very angry and anxious. Studies focus primarily on what doesn't work. Mostly on what doesn't work. And this is not a new phenomenon. Here is something from Abraham Maslow, whom we mentioned last time, talking about this phenomenon in 1954. The science of psychology has been far more successful on the negative than on the positive side. It has revealed to us much more about man's shortcomings, his illnesses, his sins, but little about his potentialities, his virtues, his achievable aspirations, or his psychological height. It is as if psychology had voluntarily restricted itself to only half its rightful jurisdiction, and that the darker, meaner half. So, what does psychology study? I mean, the psychology concentrators here know that, and others probably guess that. So we study a lot of prejudice. We study a lot depression and anxiety. We study a lot about conformity. We study a lot about misjudgments and errors. Very much focusing on this aspect. And very little, again, ratio of 21 to 1, very little on the positive. And when I look at this ratio and I think about it, and again, this is 1954. Hasn't changed much since. And when I think about it and look into it, I think that psychology needs help. I really do. I mean, think about it on the personal level. What if you had a person who 21 hours in a day was depressed and 1 hour in a day felt good, or 1 day feeling good and then 21 days feeling anxious and depressed? You would say that this person would need help. And the field, I think, needs help. But then the question becomes, is it the right analogy? I mean, should we look at it this way? Because, the 21 ratio is unhealthy. Certainly would be so on an individual level, but it reflects reality in many ways. Because what we're seeing today, and there's more and more research showing that there is more and more depression around the world, that there is more and more anxiety, east-west, north-south, around the world. And one could argue, people who argue for continuing to doing research in this area and for doing less in positive psychology is, well, we should be doing even more than the 21 to 1 ratio because we want to alleviate the anxiety and depression that people experience. Today, depression is 10 times higher than it was in 1960. Now, part of it is because there's more awareness, because we measure better, but that's not all. It's also simply because objectively there is more depression. And one way of knowing that is that the most objective, quote-unquote, measure that we have is, unfortunately, suicide. And numbers have risen significantly around the world, not just in the United States, whether it's in China, whether it's in Australia, as well as here. The mean age for depression today is less than 15. Kids at a very young age are introduced to the information highway. And very often they're not prepared, not able to deal with it in an effective way. So when we look at this data, we say we do need more research to help people overcome depression, to help people overcome anxiety. And I don't want to belittle that. That is important. Extremely important. What I am arguing, what I'm going to argue for, is the shift of the pendulum, so that it's no longer 21 to 1, so that there are more, many more studies in positive psychology. Not to the exclusion of, not at all, but just shifting the pendulum. How about here, in our local village? This article, I couldn't find a study that was more recent. This was published in 2004, Harvard Crimson. And the article says that in their 6-month study of this, 80% of Harvard students experienced depression over the past year. Now, we're not talking about the regular ups and downs that most people have 10 times a day. I certainly do. We're talking about depression here for an extended period of time. 47% of Harvard students, according to this, and granted, this is not an academic study, but I will share with you an academic study in a minute, published in a top-tier refereed journal. But what the Crimson has found in its survey is that 47% of Harvard students over the past year have experienced depression to the point of not functioning. So really, so that they couldn't leave home, they were really struggling to just basically get through the day. 47%. Now when people look at this, they say, well, of course, we need to focus more on psychopathology. 21 to 1, not enough. 30 to 1 sounds more like it. We see it around campuses. This is not peculiar to Harvard. Not at all peculiar to Harvard. Richard Caddison, who's the head of the mental health services here, in the New England Journal of Medicine, probably the leading journal in the field of medicine, recently published an article where he talked about a survey that was done among 13,500 college students nationwide. Different kinds of colleges, universities, state schools, private schools. And what they found in this very significant study was that 45% of college students nationwide over the past year have experienced depression to the point of not functioning. So at Harvard, the Crimson found 47, nationwide it was 45, essentially identical, no significant difference among the two. This is a nationwide phenomenon. In this study, 94% of college students nationwide feel overwhelmed and stressed by everything that they have to do. 94%. I mean, these are supposed to be the best 4 years of our lives. Something's going on here. Now, this is not unique to the United States. I just recently came back from a tour. I was spent time in Europe, in the UK, in France, spent a lot of time in China, and some time in Australia. In every one of these places, the governments are really concerned. University presidents are really concerned about the growing levels of depression, anxiety, and general mental disorder. Rise of suicide rates in all of these countries that I mentioned. So we have a global epidemic here. And once again, going back, so isn't the 21 to 1 ratio good? Isn't it important? Shouldn't it even be increased? How can we even think about studying happiness and well-being and love and joy? Shouldn't we first deal with the real pressing problem of depression, anxiety, neurosis, and so on? Some truth to that, but again, what I'm going to argue for in this class is that we do need to also, not only, not exclusively, not even necessarily primarily, we need to also focus on the positive. I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why we should do that. The first reason is that it is important to focus on what works, because what works, or what we focus on rather, creates reality. And if we focus on what is working, we'll have more working in our world, more working in ourselves, more working in our relationships. The second reason why positive psychology as an independent field of study, as a course in and of itself is important, is that being happy is not just the negation of happiness. It doesn't mean that if I just get rid of depression or anxiety that I'm experiencing, I spontaneously become happy. That's not the case. That's not how it works. And finally, prevention, which is very important today. The most effective ways of preventing hardship, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, is actually by focusing and cultivating the positive. And I will share some studies with you about this. So for these 3 reasons, we need a positive psychology.